You sure you're in the right section? Kid economy's that way. The massive tattooed bodybuilder's sneer cut through the first-class cabin as he eyed the 15-year-old black teen. Before Xavier Mitchell could show his valid ticket, the man snatched it from his hand. "No way this seat belongs to you." Xavier stood frozen, his expression controlled despite the humiliation burning through him. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence as the flight attendant sided with the loud, muscular men instead of checking the ticket properly. Within moments, Xavier found himself being escorted away from his rightful seat, publicly shamed in front of everyone. But what these arrogant bodybuilders didn't know was that this quiet kid's father wasn't just wealthy. He was Xavier Mitchell, undefeated 5-time MMA champion billionaire investor, and a man who'd built his career on destroying those who underestimated him. And in exactly 17 minutes, when that father walked onto this plane, after receiving his son's text message that read, simply, "Dad, they touched me," these bodybuilders would learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. Some kids have dads powerful enough to buy the entire airline. But let's start at the beginning, when a polite teenager boarded a plane and encountered the kind of toxic masculinity that mistakes size for strength and volume for power. Welcome to Black Triumphant Channel. Every story we share is more than just drama. It's a reminder of strength, resilience, and justice. If you believe in celebrating Black excellence and standing against injustice and prejudice, hit that like and subscribe button right now. We would like to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. Los Angeles International Airport hummed with pre-evening activity, the exclusive first-class lounge of Terminal B serving as an oasis of calm amid the chaos. Behind frosted glass doors and beneath soft recessed lighting, privileged travelers enjoyed amenities unavailable to the average passenger: premium open bar, gourmet buffet, plush seating, and the intangible luxury of exclusivity. Xavier Mitchell sat alone in a quiet corner, his slender fingers moving across his phone screen as he texted his grandmother that he'd be boarding soon. At 15, Xavier carried himself with uncommon poise. His 5'9" frame was dressed in a limited edition Jordan hoodie designer jeans that cost more than most people's entire outfits and custom sneakers recognizable to anyone familiar with exclusive drops. Yet there was nothing flashy about his demeanor. His wealth announced itself through quality rather than ostentation. Final boarding call for priority passengers on Flight 628 to New York came the announcement, and Xavier gathered his belongings. A sleek backpack containing his laptop, noise-canceling headphones, and a dog-eared copy of The Art of War that his father had given him on his last birthday. As he approached the gate, Xavier's mind drifted to the conversation with his father 3 days earlier. "You sure about flying alone, Jackson?" Mitchell had asked his powerful frame, seeming at odds with the gentleness in his voice as they stood in the expansive living room of their Bel Air mansion. "Dad, I'm 15. Not 5. Xavier had replied with a small smile. "Grandma's expecting me and it's a direct flight. I'll be fine." Jackson had studied his son's face before nodding. "First class only. Direct flight. Phone charged at all times. Location sharing on. Text me when you board and when you land." "I know the protocol," Xavier had said with the good-natured patience of a teenager who understood his father's protectiveness came from love. Now, as Xavier handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, he felt a small surge of pride. This was a small step toward independence, toward the man his father was raising him to be. "Have a pleasant flight, Mr. Mitchell," the gate agent said with a smile, and Xavier nodded his thanks. What Xavier didn't notice were the two men observing him from nearby: Brock the Destroyer, Lawson, and Diego Iron Arms. Hernandez, both too absorbed in filming themselves to register the teenager yet. Brock, at 6'4" and 285 pounds of sculpted muscle, dominated the space around him through sheer physical presence. His arms, thick as most men's thighs, were covered in elaborate sleeve tattoos, a chaotic tapestry of skulls, Norse mythology symbols, and motivational phrases in Gothic script. At 34, his physique testified to years of dedicated training and pharmaceutical enhancement. "What's up, Beast Nation?" Brock bellowed into his phone camera. "The destroyer here, about to fly first class to New York for the Eastern Seaboard Championship travel day, won't stop the gains. Am I right?" Beside him, Diego Hernandez, 31, performed a quick bicep flex for the camera. At 6'1" and 265 pounds, he was marginally smaller than Brock, but sported an even more extreme physique. Vascularity so pronounced that veins mapped his body like rivers on terrain muscles, so defined they seemed to strain against his tattooed skin. "Tell them about the deal, bro," Diego urged, his Miami accent still detectable despite years in California. "Almost forgot." Brock grinned, displaying teeth whitened to an unnatural brightness. "Big announcement tomorrow with Max Pump Supplements. 7-figure deal exclusive to Team Destroyer. When you're the best, the money follows." Together they commanded over 2 million followers across platforms, their daily content, a mixture of workouts, supplement promotions, lifestyle flexing, and the particular brand of aggressive motivation that measured worth in pounds lifted and inches added to biceps. As priority boarding was announced, they cut ahead of other first-class passengers, their massive gym bags swinging carelessly. The gate agent, a petite woman in her 40s, didn't challenge them. People rarely did. "Let's go." "Iron arms," Brock said loudly. "Champions fly first." "Baby." Other first-class passengers maintained careful distance, their expressions ranging from amusement to thinly veiled disdain. A silver-haired executive in an impeccable suit deliberately focused on his phone. A middle-aged couple exchanged glances but said nothing. Xavier, walking several paces behind, observed this dynamic with the quiet thoughtfulness that characterized him. His father had taught him that true power rarely announced itself. It didn't need to. As they moved through the jet bridge, Xavier sent his father a quick text. "Boarding now." "All good." Then he pocketed his phone and prepared to step aboard Flight 628, unaware that in less than 30 minutes he would send a very different message. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner gleamed under soft, ambient lighting. Unlike the cramped economy section, this sanctuary of privilege featured just 16 pod-like seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each more reminiscent of a personal suite than an airplane seat. The navy leather upholstery complemented the cabin's muted color scheme, designed to evoke calm and exclusivity. Each pod offered nearly complete privacy, a wide seat that converted to a fully flat-bed personal entertainment system with a 23-inch screen, noise-canceling headphones, storage compartments, and a sliding door that could isolate passengers from the aisle. The spacing between seats eliminated the typical discomforts of air travel, no brushing elbows or awkward interactions with strangers. It was the kind of environment where wealthy executives could work undisturbed, where celebrities could travel in relative anonymity, where the rules that applied to regular passengers somehow felt negotiable. Flight attendant Melissa Taylor, 28, stood at the entrance with a practiced smile, welcoming passengers with practiced warmth. 3 years into her career with the airline, Melissa had mastered the art of first-class service, anticipating needs, remembering names, and, perhaps most importantly, navigating the complex social dynamics of privilege. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her makeup subtle but flawless, her uniform immaculate. Nothing about her appearance suggested the exhaustion of having already worked a flight from San Francisco earlier that day, or her anxiety about making rent next week. "Good evening and welcome aboard," she greeted each passenger, offering champagne, sparkling water, or orange juice before takeoff. Already settled in seats 1A and 1B were Brock and Diego, immediately making themselves at home. They'd carelessly shoved their oversized bags into the overhead bins, reclined their seats to maximum, and were filming yet more content for their followers. "Yeah, boys," Brock was saying into his phone, panning around to show the luxury cabin. "The destroyer only flies first class. Gotta treat your body like a temple, and that means comfort when you travel. Economy. That's for regular people. We're living that champion lifestyle. Diego laughed and joined the frame, both flexing and fist-bumping for the camera. Their voices carried through the quiet cabin, drawing glances from other passengers now boarding. In seat 3C sat Alan Winters, a 67-year-old retired history professor with wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan despite the California heat. He peered over his book at the bodybuilders, sighed audibly, and then inserted his noise-canceling headphones. Across from him in 3D was Sofia Rodriguez, 36, the founder of a successful tech startup that specialized in AI solutions for healthcare. Her attention shifted between her tablet and the unfolding scene with the bodybuilders, her expression calculating rather than annoyed. Melissa approached Brock and Diego with her professional smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome aboard. Can I get you started with some champagne?" "Champagne?" Brock laughed, his voice booming. "Nah, we don't drink that weak stuff. You got any protein shakes?" Melissa's smile didn't falter. "I'm afraid we don't have protein shakes in first class, but I can offer you water juice or soft drinks." "Water's fine," Diego interrupted. "2 bottles, and keep them coming. Gotta stay hydrated. You know what I'm saying?" He winked at her. "Of course, I'll be right back." As Melissa moved away, more passengers continued boarding, a couple celebrating their anniversary, an investment banker already pulling out spreadsheets, a famous actress hiding behind oversized sunglasses, the usual mix of privileged travelers with the means and miles to avoid the discomfort of economy class. And then Xavier Mitchell appeared in the first-class entrance. He stood for a moment, taking in the cabin, appearing both confident and slightly uncertain, the look of someone who belonged in such surroundings but was still young enough to be finding his place in the world. He checked his boarding pass again, confirming seat 2A, then moved forward. As Xavier passed the first row, Brock nudged Diego. "Yo, check this out," he muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Kid looks lost." Xavier continued forward, focused on finding his seat when Diego called out, "Hey, little man, you sure you're in the right section? Economy's back that way." Xavier paused, confusion crossing his face. He double-checked his boarding pass again, then looked at the seat numbers. "I have seat 2A, he said, politely but firmly. Brock snorted. "Yeah, right. Let me see that." Before Xavier could respond, Brock reached out and snatched the boarding pass from his hand. The action so unexpected and brazen that Xavier didn't have time to react. Brock made a show of examining the ticket, then laughed. "No way this belongs to you. This has got to be fake or something." Xavier's expression remained composed, though a muscle in his jaw tightened. "That's my ticket. I'd appreciate it if you'd return it." Diego leaned over. Probably found it, or someone gave him the wrong directions. Other passengers were watching now, the cabin suddenly tense with uncomfortable silence. Sofia Rodriguez had stopped working on her tablet. Alan Winters had removed one headphone. No one intervened. Melissa returned with the water bottles, immediately sensing the tension. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking between Xavier and the bodybuilders. "This kid claims he has a first-class ticket," Brock said, still holding Xavier's boarding pass. "Says he's in 2A. Instead of asking to see the ticket herself or checking Xavier's name against the manifest, Melissa hesitated, looking at Xavier with uncertainty. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" she asked. "Yes," Xavier said calmly. "My boarding pass is for seat 2A. That man took it from me." There was a moment where Melissa could have made a different choice. Could have asked Brock to return the boarding pass, could have checked Xavier's name in the system. Instead, she chose the path of least resistance. "I think there might be some confusion," she said. "Why don't you come with me, and we can sort this out?" Xavier stood perfectly still. "There's no confusion. That's my assigned seat." Diego laughed. "Come on, kid. You know first-class tickets cost thousands, right?" "No offense, but you don't look like you belong here." It was the kind of statement that revealed more about the speaker than the subject. Xavier's designer clothes alone cost more than most people's entire wardrobes. But to Diego, belonging had a different definition, one that rarely included young black teenagers regardless of what they wore. Melissa was growing uncomfortable, aware of the attention from other passengers. "Let's just step aside for a moment," she urged Xavier, not wanting to challenge the loud, muscular men who would be in her cabin for the next 6 hours. Xavier looked at her, then at his ticket still in Brock's hand, then at the watching passengers, none of whom spoke up for him. Something in his eyes hardened, not with anger, but with recognition. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. "Fine," he said quietly. "But I'll need my boarding pass back." Brock handed it back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Good luck finding your real seat, kid." As Xavier followed Melissa toward the galley, he maintained perfect posture, his expression controlled. No one watching would have guessed at the humiliation burning inside him, the sense of injustice that threatened to close his throat. And no one, certainly not Brock or Diego, could have possibly imagined what would happen next, or who would be walking through that same cabin door in exactly 17 minutes. "That seat doesn't belong to you." Brock's voice rang out deliberately loud enough for everyone in the first-class cabin to hear. His massive frame twisted in seat 1A as Xavier attempted to explain his situation to Melissa near the galley. Melissa glanced nervously between Xavier and the bodybuilders. "Let me just check the passenger manifest," she finally said, reaching for her tablet. Xavier stood perfectly still, the boarding pass for seat 2A still clutched in his hand. At 15, he was already familiar with these moments. The instance where his presence was questioned, where he had to justify his existence, in spaces others took for granted. His father had prepared him, but knowing something would happen and experiencing it were entirely different sensations. "I don't need to see the manifest." Diego called out his voice, carrying a performative concern that fooled no one. "Look at him. He's obviously confused. Probably his first time flying wandered in from economy." Xavier's eyes met Diego's. "My boarding pass says seat 2A. First class. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Something in Xavier's calm certainty seemed to irritate Diego, whose tattooed forearms flexed as he gripped his armrests. "Tickets can be fake, you know. People try to sneak up to first class all the time." Melissa, scanning her tablet, hesitated. Xavier Mitchell was indeed listed for seat 2A, but confronting the bodybuilders seemed more difficult than dealing with the teenager. "I'm sure there's just been a mix-up," she said, avoiding Xavier's eyes. "Why don't we get you settled in another section while we sort this out?" "There's no mix-up," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his face. "I'm in seat 2A. By now, the scene had captured the complete attention of everyone in first class. Alan Winters had removed both headphones, his academic's face lined with concern. Sofia Rodriguez had stopped pretending to work on her tablet and was watching with clear disapproval. The couple celebrating their anniversary whispered to each other. The investment banker stared determinedly at his spreadsheets, choosing not to see. "This is getting ridiculous," Brock announced, standing up to his full height of 6'4". His frame blocked the aisle as he moved toward Xavier, using his size as intimidation. "Kid, you need to go find your actual seat. You're holding up the flight." "You're holding up the flight?" Xavier corrected quietly by preventing me from sitting in my assigned seat. The directness of this response seemed to catch Brock off guard. His face darkened. "Let me see that ticket again." Xavier hesitated, then extended the boarding pass. This time, Brock didn't just take it. He snatched it so forcefully that the paper tore slightly at the edge. "This says 2A, Brock announced as if discovering something new. "But that doesn't make any sense. How could you afford?" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Xavier kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "May I have my boarding pass back, please?" Instead of returning it, Brock turned to Melissa. "There's obviously some kind of mistake. Can you check if anyone else is supposed to be in 2A? Someone must have the same seat." Melissa checked her tablet again, then said reluctantly, "The system shows Xavier Mitchell assigned to seat 2A. "Xavier Mitchell," Diego repeated, looking the teenager up and down. "Never heard of you. You some kind of child actor or something." Xavier remained silent, refusing to explain or justify his presence. Brock, still holding the boarding pass, shook his head. "Nah, something's not right. I don't care what the computer says. Look at him. Look at us. Who belongs in first class?" He gestured between himself, Diego, and Xavier as if the answer were self-evident. And that's when Sofia Rodriguez had enough. The tech entrepreneur stood up, her voice clear and firm. "Excuse me, but what exactly does someone who belongs in first class look like?" Brock turned, surprised that someone had challenged him. "What?" "You heard me," Sofia continued. "You keep suggesting he doesn't belong here. I'm curious what criteria you're using to make that determination." A moment of uncomfortable silence followed as Brock realized the trap in the question. "I just meant, he's just a kid with a first-class ticket," Sofia pointed out, "which the flight attendant has confirmed is valid." Diego jumped in. "Look, we're just trying to make sure everything's right. These tickets cost thousands. It's weird for some random teenager to be up here alone." Xavier, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "I'm not random. My name is Xavier Mitchell. The ticket is mine, and I'd like it back, please." He extended his hand toward Brock. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might resolve. Then Brock made a decision that would ultimately cost him everything. Instead of returning the ticket, he folded it and shoved it into his pocket. "Nope, I'm not convinced. This needs to get sorted out properly." Sir Melissa interjected, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to ask you to return the boarding pass. It's airline property." "Then do your job and get this sorted," Brock retorted. "He shouldn't be here and you know it." The cabin was completely silent now, the tension almost visible in the air. Xavier stood alone facing two men 3 times his age and twice his size, while a plane full of adults watched and did nothing, except for Sofia, who had pulled out her phone and was quietly recording. Melissa, torn between enforcing rules and avoiding conflict with aggressive passengers, made her choice. "I'll need to call the lead flight attendant to resolve this," she said, reaching for the cabin phone. While she made the call, Xavier remained perfectly still, his face a careful mask that betrayed none of the emotions churning inside him. This was not the first time he had faced such treatment, but it was perhaps the most public, the most humiliating. At 14, he had been followed by security in an upscale department store while shopping for his father's birthday gift, despite carrying a platinum credit card. At 12, a woman had demanded to know how he could afford the limited edition sneakers he wore to a basketball game. At 10, a neighbor had called the police when he was entering his own home, claiming he looked suspicious. Each time his father had taught him the same lessons. Maintain your dignity, know your worth, choose your battles. Sometimes you fight, Jackson had told him, and sometimes you document. That memory sparked something in Xavier. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. If Brock and Diego wanted to make a scene, they would do so on record. He began filming just as Nathan Palmer, the 52-year-old senior flight attendant, arrived in the cabin. What seems to be the problem, Nathan asked, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in the air. Before Xavier could explain, Brock jumped in. "This kid's trying to sit in first class. Says he has a ticket for 2A, but something's not adding up." Nathan turned to Xavier. "Young man, can I see your boarding pass, please?" "He has it," Xavier said, nodding toward Brock. "He took it from me and refused to give it back." Nathan's eyebrows rose as he turned to Brock. "Sir, I'll need to see that boarding pass." Brock hesitated, then reluctantly pulled the folded paper from his pocket. "I'm just saying it seems weird. Kid his age alone in first class." Nathan examined the boarding pass, then checked his tablet. "This appears to be in order. Xavier Mitchell, seat 2A. He handed the pass back to Xavier, not to Brock. "Mr. Mitchell, you're welcome to take your assigned seat." For a moment it seemed the situation was resolved. Then Diego spoke up. "Wait, so you're just taking his word for it? What if he stole that ticket? What if he's not even this Mitchell kid?" Nathan's expression tightened. "Sir, we've verified the passenger's identity. The matter is settled." "It's not settled for me," Brock insisted, his voice rising. "I don't feel comfortable with some random teenager sitting up here. I paid good money for this flight." "So did I," Xavier said quietly, still filming. "Put that phone away," Diego snapped, suddenly noticing the recording. "You can't film us without permission. Actually, there's no expectation of privacy in a public setting. Like an airplane," Xavier replied calmly, quoting something his father had taught him. Diego's face darkened with anger. "Give me that phone." And before anyone could react, he lunged forward, grabbing Xavier's wrist and trying to wrestle the phone away. The contact was brief, just a few seconds, but it crossed a line. Xavier pulled back, maintaining his grip on his phone, his composure finally cracking as he stumbled against a seat. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Nathan stepped between them immediately. "Sir, you cannot touch another passenger. That's completely unacceptable." The cabin erupted in voices. Brock defending his friend Sophia and Alan objecting to the bodybuilder's behavior, the anniversary couple demanding something be done. In the chaos, Xavier saw his opportunity to slip away. Not to his seat, that battle seemed lost for now, but to the relative safety of the galley area. Once there, hands trembling slightly, he opened his messaging app and sent a text to his father. "Dad, they touched me." 3 words, no explanation needed. Xavier knew exactly what would happen next. His father had always told him, "If anyone ever puts their hands on you, I need to know immediately." It wasn't helicopter parenting, it was the reality of being a young black man in America. As he waited in the galley, caught between the first-class cabin where he belonged and the economy section where others thought he should be, Xavier felt a complex mix of emotions: humiliation, anger, vindication, and beneath it all, a cold certainty that justice was about to board this plane. The galley area between cabins existed in a strange liminal space, neither here nor there, a transitional zone never meant for lingering. Xavier stood with his back against the wall, feeling simultaneously exposed and invisible as economy passengers continued to board, streaming past him with curious glances. His designer hoodie suddenly felt too warm. The limited edition sneakers that had felt like armor that morning now seemed to mark him as a target. His skin prickled with awareness, of eyes on him, of judgments being made, of assumptions settling around his shoulders like an unwelcome weight. Nathan Palmer approached, concern etched on his face. "Mitchell, I apologize for what happened. We're working to resolve the situation. If you'd like to take your seat?" "No," Xavier said quietly. "I'd rather wait here for now." The thought of walking back into that cabin past the bodybuilders, feeling the weight of everyone's stares, it was too much even for his carefully cultivated composure. Nathan nodded, understanding. "I'll be speaking with the captain about the behavior of those passengers. Touching another passenger is completely unacceptable." Xavier nodded but said nothing. Words felt inadequate in this moment. As Nathan returned to the cabin, Xavier's mind drifted to a day 3 years earlier. He'd been 12 shopping with his father at an exclusive mall in Beverly Hills. While Jackson took a business call outside, Xavier had wandered into a high-end watch store, fascinated by the intricate mechanisms displayed in the window. The security guard had appeared almost immediately. "Can I help you?" The question hadn't been an offer of assistance, but a challenge. "I'm just looking," Xavier had replied. "This store is for serious customers." Only the guard had said, moving closer. "I'll have to ask you to leave." Before Xavier could respond, his father had appeared in the doorway. Jackson Mitchell hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply stepped forward, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and looked at the guard. "Is there a problem with my son looking at watches?" The recognition had been immediate. Jackson Mitchell, 5-time MMA champion sports team owner, the face of countless endorsement deals. The guard had stammered an apology, the store manager had appeared with offers of refreshments, the situation had transformed in seconds. Afterward, in the car, Xavier had asked, "Does it always work like that?" Having power. His father had been quiet for a moment before answering. "Power changes how people treat you. Yes. But remember this, if they only respect you because of what you have or who they think you are, that's not real respect. Real respect is what you deserve as a human being regardless of your name or bank account." That lesson resonated now as Xavier stood in the airplane galley feeling the sting of being treated as if he didn't belong. The bodybuilders hadn't respected his humanity, only reacted to what they assumed about him. A flight attendant he hadn't seen before, younger than Melissa, passed through the galley and gave him a curious look. "Are you waiting for the lavatory?" she asked. "No," Xavier said. "I'm just waiting." She frowned slightly. "Passengers need to be in their seats for takeoff." "What's your seat number 2A?" Xavier replied. "But there's been an issue." Before he could explain further, Melissa appeared. "It's okay, Lisa. I've got this." The younger flight attendant nodded and continued toward economy. Melissa couldn't quite meet Xavier's eyes. "I'm sorry about what happened," she said, her voice low. "Nathan is speaking with those passengers." Xavier's heart was pounding a steady drum of adrenaline and indignation, but his voice remained level. "They took my ticket. They questioned my right to be here. And then they put their hands on me, all while I was trying to sit in the seat I paid for." Melissa flinched at his directness. "I know, and it's not right. I should have handled it differently from the beginning." "Yes," Xavier agreed, "you should have." The simple statement hung between them, unadorned by excuses or explanations. Just the truth. Xavier's phone vibrated in his pocket, his father no doubt responding to his text. But before he could check it, Melissa spoke again. "We're going to get this sorted out. The captain has been informed, and it's already being sorted." Xavier interrupted, a certainty in his voice that made Melissa pause. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. The boarding process continued around them, the cabin gradually filling with the low murmur of conversations. The thud of bags being stowed, the mechanical sounds of an aircraft preparing for departure. Through it all, Xavier remained perfectly still, his back straight, his expression composed. Only the slight tremor in his hands betrayed the storm inside him. A young white woman passing by to the lavatory did a double-take. "Aren't you Xavier Mitchell?" she asked. Jackson Mitchell's son, Xavier, nodded once without elaboration. The woman's eyes widened. "I follow your dad on Instagram. His training videos are amazing." Then, picking up on Xavier's tense posture and the unusual situation of him standing in the galley, she asked, "Is everything okay?" "It will be," Xavier replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. As she walked away, Xavier finally checked his phone. His father had responded to his text with a single line, "I'm on my way. Don't move. Don't say anything else." Xavier exhaled slowly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The weight on his chest lightened slightly. His father was coming. In some ways, Xavier hated that he needed the intervention. At 15, he wanted to handle his own problems, fight his own battles. But he also understood what his father had always taught him. Sometimes the wisest decision was knowing when to call for backup. From his position, Xavier could just see into the first-class cabin where Brock and Diego were now loudly complaining to Nathan about the delay. Their voices carried clearly. "This is ridiculous," Brock was saying. "We have a competition tomorrow. We can't be sitting here all day because of some kid." "Sir," "As I've explained," Nathan replied, his professional tone strained. "We're addressing the situation." "Yeah." "Well, address it faster," Diego shot back. "And tell that kid to stop filming us. That's harassment." Their indignation was so misplaced, so disconnected from the reality of what had occurred that Xavier almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing, centering himself the way his father had taught him during their morning meditation sessions. In holdout. In holdout. The technique helped calm the churning in his stomach, the burning sensation at the back of his throat. He was still standing there, breathing deliberately, when Sofia Rodriguez appeared in the galley. She approached him directly, keeping her voice low. I recorded everything she said without preamble. What they did wasn't right, and I want you to know I've got the video if you need it. Xavier studied her, surprised by the direct offer of support. "Thank you. I've seen this happen too many times," she continued. "People using their size, their privilege, their loudness to push others around. It's not okay." For the first time since the confrontation began, Xavier felt something loosen in his chest. The simple relief of being seen, of having his experience validated. "They won't get away with it," he said quietly. Something in his tone made Sofia look at him more closely. "You called someone, didn't you?" Xavier just nodded. "Good," Sofia said. "You shouldn't have to fight these battles alone." She handed him a business card. "Sofia Rodriguez, founder of Meditech AI. If you need another witness, call me." As she returned to her seat, Xavier tucked the card into his pocket, thinking about her words. You shouldn't have to fight these battles alone. His father had said something similar once after Xavier had tried to handle a racist comment from a soccer teammate without involving adults. The strongest warriors know when to call in reinforcements. It's not weakness to ask for help, it's strategy. At the time, Xavier hadn't fully understood. Now, standing in the airplane galley, feeling the weight of stares from passengers and crew, he finally did. The cabin intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a slight delay at the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to be on our way shortly." The announcement was standard, the language unremarkable, but Xavier recognized it for what it was, time being made. His father was coming. Xavier checked his watch. 8 minutes had passed since he'd sent that text. If his father had been at home in Bel Air when he received it, he would still be at least 15 minutes away, even with his driver taking every shortcut. But Jackson Mitchell was never just at the mercy of traffic. He had resources, connections, the ability to make impossible things happen. Xavier had no doubt his father would find a way to reach him before this plane left the gate. All he had to do was wait. Xavier's phone vibrated again. Another text from his father. "I'm at the airport. Thomas is handling security. 5 minutes." Xavier felt a rush of both relief and anxiety. His father was already at the airport, likely in a meeting at one of his company offices in the international terminal. That meant things would happen faster than he'd anticipated. Part of him wanted to warn Brock and Diego to give them some chance to prepare for what was coming. But another part, the part still burning with humiliation, was content to let events unfold without intervention. The plane remained at the gate, the cabin door still open. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, their practiced smiles growing strained as the delay continued. Passengers checked watches and phones, murmuring about connections and schedules. In the first-class cabin, Brock and Diego had moved on from complaining to filming more content, seemingly unbothered by the disruption they'd caused. Their loud laughter carried to where Xavier stood, each chuckle like salt in an open wound. Mr. Mitchell Nathan approached again. "We're working to resolve this situation. Would you like to wait in the cockpit until things are settled?" The captain has extended the invitation. The offer was clearly meant as a kindness, a safe space away from the men who had harassed him. But Xavier shook his head. "My father will be here soon. I'll wait." Nathan's brow furrowed. "Your father?" "Sir, we're preparing for departure. The cabin door will be closing shortly." "No," Xavier said with absolute certainty. "It won't." Something in his tone must have communicated more than his words, because Nathan studied him more closely. "Your father is coming to the aircraft." Xavier nodded once. "May I ask who your father is?" "Jackson Mitchell." The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water, ripples of recognition expanding across Nathan's face. Jackson Mitchell, 5-time undefeated MMA champion. Jackson Mitchell, billionaire investor. Jackson Mitchell, owner of the LA Predators basketball team. Jackson Mitchell, known for his philanthropy, his business acumen, and his absolute unwavering protection of his only son. "I see," Nathan said carefully. "I'll inform the captain." As Nathan hurried away, Xavier leaned back against the wall, suddenly exhausted by the tension of the past 20 minutes. His mind wandered to his grandmother waiting in New York, her apartment in Harlem filled with photos chronicling their family's journey. Her own parents, who had marched for civil rights herself as a young teacher fighting for equal education. Xavier's father rising from a rough neighborhood to international fame, and now Xavier, the next generation. "You carry all of us with you," she often told him, "our struggles and our triumphs." The weight of that legacy pressed on him now. How would she react when he told her about this incident? Would she be disappointed that he hadn't stood his ground more firmly? Or would she understand his strategic retreat? His decision to call for backup? Xavier's thoughts were interrupted by increased activity at the front of the plane. Through the narrow galley opening, he could see ground staff speaking urgently with the lead flight attendant. Something was happening at the gate. His phone buzzed again. "I'm boarding now." Xavier straightened up, adrenaline flooding back through his system. It was happening. His father was coming. A buzz seemed to travel through the aircraft. The subtle shift in energy that happens when something unexpected disrupts routine. Passengers who had been scrolling through phones or magazines now looked toward the front of the plane. Conversations paused mid-sentence. And then Jackson Mitchell appeared in the doorway of the aircraft. Even if he hadn't been internationally famous, Jackson would have commanded attention. At 43, he carried his 6'2" frame with the controlled grace of a lifelong athlete. His custom charcoal suit fit perfectly across broad shoulders that had carried championship belts 5 separate times. His close-cropped hair was edged with silver at the temples, and the subtle scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from his 3rd title defense, only enhanced his striking appearance. But it was his presence, more than his physicality, that filled the space. Jackson Mitchell moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, the absolute self-possession that came from having faced the world's most dangerous fighters in an octagon and walked away victorious every time. His eyes, dark and focused, scanned the cabin until they found Xavier standing in the galley. In 3 long strides, he was at his son's side. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for Xavier. "No," Xavier replied. "Just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jackson placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of both reassurance and assessment. Satisfied that Xavier was physically unharmed, he turned his attention to Nathan, who had appeared at his side. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Nathan Palmer, the lead flight attendant. We're addressing the situation with the passengers who harassed your son." Jackson nodded once. "I appreciate that, but I'll be handling it from here." The statement wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was simply information being provided. This is what will happen next. Nathan, recognizing both the man's fame and the quiet authority in his voice, nodded. Of course. The captain has been informed of the situation. Good, Jackson said. Then to Xavier. Show me who did this. Xavier straightened his shoulders and nodded toward the first-class cabin. The two bodybuilders in 1A and 1B. The bigger one took my boarding pass. The other one grabbed my wrist when I started recording. Something dangerous flashed in Jackson's eyes, there and gone so quickly that only those who knew him well would have caught it. But his voice remained perfectly level. I understand. Wait here. As Jackson turned toward the first-class cabin, Xavier reached out and caught his arm. Dad, don't. Jackson looked back at his son. Trust me. With those two words, he moved forward, stepping into the cabin where Brock and Diego remained oblivious to what was about to happen. Neither of them was looking toward the entrance, too absorbed in their phones and their own importance to notice the shift in the air, the sudden silence from other passengers, the arrival of judgment. Xavier watched his father's back as he approached the men who had humiliated him, and despite everything he felt a surge of something like pity for Brock and Diego. They had no idea what was coming. 20 minutes earlier, Jackson Mitchell had been reviewing investment projections in a conference room at LAX's International Terminal. As the majority stakeholder in a luxury hotel chain expanding into airport locations, he made a point of visiting the construction site whenever he was near the airport. The meeting with contractors had been productive, the timeline for the new property on track. Then his phone had vibrated with a message from Xavier Dad. They touched me. The world stopped. 3 words that changed everything. 3 words that had been part of their family protocol since Xavier was old enough to understand. The signal that would cut through any meeting, any event, any obligation. The emergency code that meant drop everything. We need to pause, Jackson said, rising from the conference table, his voice betraying none of the urgency coursing through him. Something's come up. His assistant Thomas Reeves immediately recognized the shift. At 38, Thomas had worked with Jackson for nearly a decade, managing the complex logistics of a billionaire's life with quiet efficiency. More importantly, he understood the hierarchy of Jackson's priorities, with Xavier unquestionably at the top. The Mitchell jet. Thomas asked, already gathering documents. Jackson shook his head. No time. Xavier's on a commercial flight at Terminal B. Texted the emergency code. Thomas was already on his phone as they strode from the room, calling their security team, then the airline's executive offices. By the time they reached the SUV waiting outside, he had the flight details: United 628 to New York, scheduled departure in 30 minutes, currently still boarding. Get us to Terminal B, Jackson instructed the driver. And get me someone from United on the phone who can make decisions. As the vehicle navigated airport traffic, Thomas passed him a phone. United's VP of Customer Experience. They're holding the flight. Jackson took the phone. This is Jackson Mitchell. My son is on your flight to New York, and he's just informed me that he's been physically accosted by other passengers. His voice was calm, but carried the implicit weight of his resources, his connections, and his resolve. I'm on my way to the aircraft now. Nothing moves until I get there. The response was immediate assurance. The flight would be held. Security was being notified. The captain had been informed. Jackson ended the call and turned to Thomas. Get me everything you can on who's flying first class on that plane. As they pulled up to Terminal B, Thomas was already scrolling through information on his tablet. Security will meet us at the checkpoint. They're expediting us through. True to his word, a senior security officer was waiting as they entered the terminal. Mr. Mitchell, we've been instructed to escort you directly to the gate. Jackson nodded, once his focus absolute. As they moved through the terminal, other travelers recognized him. Double-takes whispers, a few raised phones, snapping photos of the famous fighter. He ignored it all, his mind consumed with reaching Xavier. At the security checkpoint, they were ushered through a separate lane, bypassing the usual procedures. The special treatment wasn't just because of Jackson's fame or wealth. The airport's security director owed him personally after Jackson had quietly funded a program supporting the families of TSA agents during the government shutdown 3 years earlier. "The flight is at gate B-23, the escort informed them, still at the jet bridge doors open. As they approached the gate, Jackson caught sight of Karen Wilson, a 47-year-old supervisor he recognized from previous flights. Her expression shifted from professional concern to recognition as she saw who was approaching. "Mr. Mitchell, we've been notified of the situation. I'm so sorry about what happened to your son. I need to board immediately," Jackson said, not interested in apologies until he'd seen Xavier. Karen hesitated. "Sir, the boarding process is complete and we're preparing for departure." "I understand your concern," but Jackson cut her off with a raised hand. "My son texted me that he was physically assaulted by other passengers on your aircraft. I'm going to board that plane now. The only question is whether you're going to facilitate that or whether I need to make some calls." It wasn't a bluff. As a major airline shareholder and owner of several airport properties, Jackson had direct lines to people who could ground flights with a single word. Karen recognized both his determination and his influence. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. Let me escort you personally." As they moved down the jet bridge, Thomas handed Jackson his tablet. First-class passenger manifest. 2 bodybuilders, Brock Lawson and Diego Hernandez. Social media personalities with about 4 million followers combined. They're headed to a competition in New York. Jackson absorbed this information, his mind already calculating approaches and outcomes. By the time he reached the aircraft door, he had a clear strategy. This wouldn't be settled with fists or threats. Those were tools of the undisciplined, the uncontrolled. True power moved differently. The flight attendant at the door recognized him immediately. "Mr. Mitchell." "We weren't expecting." "My son is on this flight," Jackson said, already moving past her into the cabin. "Where is he?" His eyes scanned the first-class section, not seeing Xavier. For a moment, alarm spiked through him until he spotted his son standing in the galley. Relief washed through Jackson as he quickly closed the distance between them. Xavier was physically unharmed. That was the priority. The rest could be addressed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice pitched for Xavier's ears alone. "No," Xavier replied. "Just..." The unfinished sentence carried all that needed to be said. Jackson placed a hand on his son's shoulder, both a gesture of comfort and a quick assessment. Then he turned to deal with the situation. The lead flight attendant introduced himself, explaining that they were addressing the situation, but Jackson had heard similar phrases too many times before. Well-meaning words that often led to half measures, to compromises that prioritized convenience over justice. That wouldn't happen today. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I'll be handling it from here." When Xavier pointed out the men responsible, Jackson felt a cold fury settle in his chest. But his face revealed nothing as he instructed his son to wait. "Dad." "Don't," Xavier started. Jackson looked back, understanding his son's concern. "Trust me." With that, he moved toward the first-class cabin, aware of the eyes tracking his movement, the sudden hush falling over the passengers. News traveled fast on an airplane. Most people already knew something was happening, though few would have expected Jackson Mitchell to be part of it. As he approached row 1, he could see the 2 bodybuilders clearly. They were exactly as Thomas's research had described Brock Lawson, enormous and heavily tattooed, and Diego Hernandez slightly smaller but still imposing. Both were focused on their phones, oblivious to his approach. Jackson stopped directly beside their row. "Gentlemen," the single word spoken in a voice that had announced multiple championship victories cut through their distraction. Both men looked up, confusion giving way to recognition as they processed who was standing before them. "Holy shit," Diego said. "You're Jackson Mitchell." No way, Brock's eyes widened. We're huge fans, man. Your fight against Dominguez was legendary. Their excitement quickly turned to confusion when Jackson didn't respond with the usual appreciation fans expected. Instead, he looked at them with a steady gaze that had made hardened fighters look away first. I understand you had an issue with a young man trying to sit in seat 2A. Jackson said, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent that raised immediate alarms for both men. Oh, that, Brock said, waving dismissively. Yeah, some kid tried to sit up here, obviously in the wrong place. We were just helping the flight attendants sort it out. I see, Jackson said. And did sorting it out involve taking his boarding pass and putting your hands on him? The question hung in the air, dangerous in its simplicity. Diego shifted uncomfortably. Look, there was obviously some confusion. The kid started filming us without permission, and I just... That kid, Jackson interrupted, is my son. The words landed like a thunderclap in the quiet cabin. Brock's face drained of color. Diego froze mid-sentence. Around them, other passengers reacted with murmurs and wide eyes, the drama unfolding before them better than any in-flight entertainment. Your son, Brock repeated, his voice suddenly much smaller than his frame would suggest. Jackson nodded once. Xavier Mitchell, 15 years old, flying to visit his grandmother in New York, sitting in seat 2A, which he paid for until you decided he didn't belong there. The implication behind his words was clear, and both bodybuilders recognized it immediately. Their behavior hadn't just been rude, it had revealed assumptions based on Xavier's race and age. Mr. Mitchell Diego began, his tone shifting to desperate placation. There was a misunderstanding. We didn't know that he was my son. Jackson finished the sentence. And if he hadn't been, if he had just been any young black teenager with a valid first-class ticket, would that have made your behavior acceptable? The question wasn't really a question. It was a mirror forcing them to confront the ugliness of their actions without the comfort of excuses. Brock, desperate to salvage the situation, tried another approach. We're huge supporters of your career, sir. Have been for years. We didn't mean any disrespect. And yet, Jackson replied, disrespect is exactly what you showed. Not just to my son, but to yourselves, to this flight crew, and to everyone watching. The coldness in his voice made both men flinch. This wasn't the Jackson Mitchell from interviews and endorsement deals. This was the calculating strategist who had dismantled opponents in the octagon, who had built a business empire from nothing, who protected what was his with absolute resolve. What happens next, Jackson continued, is entirely up to you. While Xavier had waited in the airplane galley, his father had been navigating a complex series of obstacles to reach him. The journey from the international terminal to Flight 628 had been a masterclass in determination meeting bureaucracy, a collision between one man's resolve and an entire airport's procedures. After receiving Xavier's text, Jackson had immediately terminated his meeting, but even for someone of his resources, an airport presented unique challenges. Security checkpoints, terminal distances, boarding protocols, none of them designed to accommodate a father's urgent need to reach his son. As their SUV had pulled away from the international terminal, Thomas had been working his phone with practiced efficiency. Getting pushback from gate staff, he reported. They're saying boarding is complete, and they can't allow anyone else on the aircraft. Jackson's jaw had tightened. Call Adrian Williams. Adrian was United's chief operations officer, someone he'd met during investment discussions the previous year. Already tried. She's in Dubai for the airline conference. Then get me Greg Pearson. As the head of the airport authority and a former business partner, Greg owed Jackson several favors. While Thomas made that call, Jackson had been texting Xavier, I'm at the airport. Thomas is handling security. 5 minutes. The SUV had navigated to Terminal B, where a security officer was already waiting at the curb. Greg's influence working quickly. As they moved through the terminal, Jackson's focus had narrowed to a single point, reaching his son. At the TSA checkpoint, another obstacle had appeared, The supervising officer following protocol had insisted that everyone, even expedited passengers, needed to remove shoes and electronics. "Sir, I understand the urgency, but I can't bypass basic security protocols," the officer had explained. Jackson had been about to respond when Thomas stepped forward, showing something on his phone to the supervisor. Whatever it was, likely documentation of Jackson's security clearance from his work with various government agencies, it had changed the equation immediately. "My apologies, Mr. Mitchell. Please proceed." As they'd moved through the terminal, Jackson had been mentally rehearsing approaches. Violence wasn't an option. Not because he couldn't handle two bodybuilders, he absolutely could, but because it wasn't the example he wanted to set for Xavier. Threats were similarly off the table. His response needed to be measured strategic and effective. At gate B23, they'd encountered Karen Wilson, the supervisor, who had initially hesitated to allow him to board. Now, as Jackson stood in the first-class cabin confronting Brock and Diego, he was acutely aware of how many barriers had tried to prevent this moment, and how easily he had overcome them due to his status, his connections, and his resources. It was a privilege Xavier couldn't yet access on his own, a reality that fueled Jackson's determination to handle this situation in a way that would provide lasting lessons for everyone involved. What happens next? Jackson had just told the bodybuilders is entirely up to you. Brock swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. We didn't mean any harm, sir." "Intent and impact are different things," Jackson replied. "Your actions harmed my son regardless of what you meant." Diego leaned forward, desperation evident in his expression. "Look, we made a mistake, okay? We'll apologize to the kid, to your son. An apology is a starting point," Jackson acknowledged. "But it doesn't erase consequences." He glanced around the cabin, noting the attentive audience their confrontation had gathered. Every passenger was watching intently, some even recording discreetly on their phones. This had become more than a private dispute. It was now a public reckoning. Jackson lowered his voice, making both men lean in to hear him. "Here's what's going to happen. You will apologize to my son, sincerely and publicly. You will acknowledge exactly what you did wrong. Then you will leave this aircraft and take a different flight." "Leave?" Brock protested. "But we have a competition tomorrow. We can't miss this flight. You should have considered that before putting your hands on a minor." Jackson replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "This is bullshit," Diego muttered, then immediately regretted it when Jackson's gaze locked onto him. "Would you care to repeat that?" Jackson asked quietly. Diego shrank back. "No, sir. I thought not." Jackson straightened. "Nathan," he called to the lead flight attendant who was hovering nearby. "I'd like to speak with the captain, please." Nathan nodded. "He's already requested to see you, Mr. Mitchell." As Nathan led him toward the cockpit, Jackson glanced back at Xavier, still standing in the galley. He gave his son a reassuring nod, a silent communication that things were under control. In the confined space of the cockpit, Captain James Foster, 59, greeted Jackson with professional courtesy. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand there's been an incident involving your son." "Yes." "He was physically accosted by two passengers after they questioned his right to sit in first class." Captain Foster's expression darkened. "That's completely unacceptable. I want to assure you we take this very seriously." "I appreciate that," Jackson replied. "I'm requesting that these passengers be removed from the flight." The captain considered this. "That's within my authority, especially given the report of physical contact. However, I should inform you that removing passengers will require documentation, possible police involvement, and would likely delay our departure by at least an hour." "I understand. My son's safety and dignity are worth the delay." Captain Foster nodded. "Then that's what we'll do. I'll have my first officer contact operations to begin the procedure." As they discussed the details, Jackson was aware that elsewhere in the airport, Thomas would be making arrangements, ensuring that Xavier's story wouldn't be buried, that the airline wouldn't later minimize what had happened, that consequences would extend beyond just this flight. When Jackson emerged from the cockpit, he found the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Brock and Diego were huddled in conversation, their expressions anxious. Other passengers were watching the situation unfold with varying degrees of interest, concern, and impatience. Some looked annoyed at the delay. Others seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. Jackson returned to where Xavier waited. "The captain is having them removed," he told his son quietly. "They'll apologize first." Xavier studied his father's face. "You're not leaving with them. You're staying on the flight." "I'm staying with you," Jackson confirmed. "We'll go to New York together. Your grandmother is expecting us both." Relief washed across Xavier's features before he schooled his expression back to neutrality. "I could have handled it myself." "I know you could have," Jackson said, the pride evident in his voice. "But you shouldn't have to." Nathan approached them, his manner respectful. "Mr. Mitchell, the captain, has instructed Mr. Lawson and Mr. Hernandez to gather their belongings. They've agreed to apologize to your son before deplaning." "Thank you," Jackson said. Then to Xavier. "Are you comfortable with that?" Xavier considered the question seriously. "Yes. I want to hear what they have to say." Together they moved back into the first-class cabin. Xavier standing tall beside his father, his composure restored now that he was no longer facing the situation alone. Brock and Diego had risen from their seats, their carry-ons hastily packed. Both men looked diminished somehow, their imposing physiques no longer projecting the same confidence. "Go ahead," Nathan prompted them. Brock stepped forward first, unable to quite meet Xavier's eyes. "I want to apologize for my behavior. I had no right to take your boarding pass or question whether you belonged here. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." Diego followed his apology, similarly strained but seemingly genuine. "I'm sorry for grabbing your wrist and trying to take your phone. There's no excuse for putting hands on you. It was completely out of line." Xavier listened to both apologies with dignity, neither accepting nor rejecting them explicitly. When they finished, he simply nodded once. "Thank you for acknowledging what you did." The maturity in his response seemed to further chasten both men, who had expected either angry rejection or quick forgiveness, not this measured acknowledgement that placed the responsibility squarely back on them. As they were escorted from the aircraft, passengers began to murmur among themselves. The delay had now extended to almost 40 minutes, and some were clearly concerned about connections or schedules. Captain Foster's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for the delay in our departure. We had to address a situation involving passengers who violated our code of conduct. We take the safety and dignity of all our passengers seriously. We should be underway shortly. Thank you for your patience." The announcement served multiple purposes, explaining the delay, publicly validating that something serious had occurred, and establishing that the airline was taking a clear position. As Xavier finally moved to his rightful seat in 2A, Jackson took the empty seat beside him in 2B. The seats previously occupied by Brock and Diego remained conspicuously vacant, a visual reminder of consequences. Sofia Rodriguez leaned forward from her seat. "I'm glad to see justice served," she said to Xavier. "I've got the whole thing recorded if you need it." "Thank you," Xavier replied. "My father might want to see that." Jackson turned to Sofia, recognizing a potential ally. "I appreciate you speaking up for my son when others didn't." "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. "Too many people stay silent." As the plane finally began to push back from the gate, Xavier turned to his father. "I'm sorry I couldn't handle it myself. Don't apologize for asking for help when you needed it." Jackson said firmly. "That's not weakness, it's wisdom. But you had to leave your meeting rush across the airport." "Xavier." Jackson's voice was gentle but serious. "There is nothing more important to me than you. No meeting, no deal, no obligation would ever come before your safety." Xavier nodded, accepting this truth that he knew intellectually but sometimes struggled to fully believe emotionally. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, father and son sat side by side, each processing the events of the past hour in his own way. For Xavier, it had been a harsh reminder of the realities he faced as a young black man, but also a powerful lesson in having the courage to ask for help. For Jackson, it had been yet another reminder of how the world could treat his son when he wasn't there to protect him, and how essential it was to prepare Xavier for that reality while still allowing him to maintain his dignity and sense of self-worth. The plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the sky over Los Angeles, carrying them both toward New York, and toward the grandmother who had taught Jackson the same lessons about strength, dignity, and justice that he now passed on to Xavier. The confrontation was over, but its echoes would continue to resonate, rippling outward in ways neither of them could yet fully anticipate. While Jackson had been making his way to the aircraft, the situation in the first-class cabin had deteriorated further. Brock and Diego, emboldened by their apparent victory in removing Xavier from their space, had grown increasingly vocal and dismissive. "Can you believe that kid tried to sit up here?" Brock had said loudly, performing for his social media audience as much as for the other passengers. "Some people just don't know their place." Diego had laughed, adding, "Probably saved up his allowance for months, thought he could hang with the big boys." Their commentary continued, each remark more inappropriate than the last, all captured on Sofia Rodriguez's phone as she recorded discreetly from her seat. She wasn't the only one documenting the moment. Alan Winters had begun taking notes in a small leather-bound journal, his academic's mind cataloging the behaviors he was witnessing. Nathan Palmer had attempted to intervene. "Gentlemen, I need to ask you to lower your voices. Other passengers are trying to rest." "We paid good money for these seats," Diego had countered. "We can talk if we want to." "It's not about talking," Nathan had clarified. "It's about the content and volume of your conversation. You're making others uncomfortable." Brock had scoffed. "If they're uncomfortable, they can move to economy with that kid." The remark had drawn a visible reaction from several passengers, including Sophia, who had finally spoken up. "That kid had a valid first-class ticket which you took from him. I saw the whole thing. Mind your own business," Lady Diego had shot back. "When you publicly humiliate a teenager, you make it everyone's business." Sophia had replied coolly. The exchange had created a clear division in the cabin. Those who supported the bodybuilders' behavior, none those who opposed it several, and those who remained uncomfortably silent most. It was a microcosm of how injustice often played out in society. A few perpetrators, a few vocal opponents, and a majority of uneasy bystanders. As the confrontation escalated, Melissa had retreated to the galley where Xavier was still standing. "I'm so sorry," she had told him, genuine remorse in her voice. "I should have checked your boarding pass myself from the beginning. I shouldn't have let them treat you that way." Xavier had acknowledged her apology with a nod, but offered no absolution. The damage had been done. When word had spread through the crew that Jackson Mitchell was on his way to the aircraft, the dynamic had shifted again. Nathan had informed Brock and Diego that there was a situation developing that concerned them without specifying what it was. "What situation?" Brock had demanded. "We're already running late. This flight needs to get moving." "Yeah," Diego had added. "We've got a competition tomorrow." "Time sensitive, you know." Nathan had maintained his professional demeanor. "I understand, sir. But this matter requires attention before we can depart." The bodybuilders' irritation had grown as the delay extended their sense of entitlement, clashing with the crew's newfound assertiveness. They had no idea that their actions had set in motion forces far beyond their control, that the father of the teenager they had humiliated was making his way through the airport with single-minded purpose. By the time Jackson Mitchell had appeared in the first-class cabin, Brock and Diego had been checking their watches repeatedly, complaining about the delay and filming more content for their followers, completely unaware that they were about to become the subject of a very different kind of viral moment. Now, as they stood in the jet bridge, luggage in hand, and futures suddenly uncertain, the reality of their situation was beginning to dawn on them. "This is insane," Brock muttered, running a hand through his short hair. "Do you know how much these tickets cost? They can't just kick us off. They just did," Diego replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "That was Jackson Mitchell. Do you understand who he is? A fighter." "Yeah, I know. Not just a fighter. The fighter. 5-time undefeated champion. Worth billions. Owns half of LA, and we just messed with his kid." The implications were settling over them like a heavy weight, heavier than anything they'd ever lifted in the gym. This wasn't just about missing their flight or having to make alternate arrangements. This was about having very publicly picked the wrong person to harass, and now facing consequences that could extend far beyond this moment. Karen Wilson approached them in the jet bridge, her expression professionally neutral. "Gentlemen, I've arranged for you to be rebooked on our 9:30 p.m. flight to New York. That's the earliest available option." 9:30. Brock protested. "That's 4 hours from now. We can't wait that long." "I'm afraid all other flights to New York this evening are fully booked," Karen replied. "The 9:30 is your only option with our airline." "This is ridiculous," Diego said. "We got kicked off because some rich guy's kid complained. That's discrimination against us." Karen's professional veneer cracked slightly, a flash of genuine disapproval crossing her features. "Mr. Hernandez, you were removed from the aircraft because you physically grabbed another passenger, a minor, after taking his rightful boarding pass. That violates our passenger code of conduct and quite possibly the law." "I barely touched him," Diego protested. "Any unwanted physical contact with another passenger, particularly a minor, is grounds for removal," Karen stated firmly. "You're fortunate that Mr. Mitchell hasn't insisted on involving airport police." That silenced both men momentarily as they considered the alternative. Being escorted through the terminal in handcuffs, their mugshots potentially appearing online, criminal charges being filed. "The 9:30 flight will be fine," Brock finally said, deflated. "Can we at least wait in the lounge?" Karen shook her head. "I'm afraid your lounge privileges have been suspended pending review by our customer relations department." As the full weight of the situation settled over them, Brock and Diego exchanged worried glances. This wasn't just about a delayed arrival or missed comfort. This was the beginning of what could become a very public downfall. "My phone's blowing up," Diego said, looking at the screen. "People are already posting about this. How did they find out so fast?" The answer, though they didn't know it yet, was Sofia Rodriguez. Her discreetly recorded video of their behavior had already been uploaded to her substantial social media following, with a simple caption, "Watch how these bodybuilders treat a black teenager in first class. Then discover who his father is." Justice served. The video was spreading like wildfire across platforms, being picked up by accounts dedicated to exposing public bad behavior. Within hours, it would reach millions of viewers, each forming their own judgments about Brock Lawson and Diego Hernandez. As they trudged through the terminal toward the general waiting area, both men were already feeling the first tremors of what would soon become an earthquake in their carefully constructed public personas. Diego's phone buzzed with a text from their manager. "What the hell is happening? Call me immediately." The consequences were just beginning to unfold, rippling outward from that first moment of prejudice and entitlement. For two men who had built careers on projecting strength, they were about to learn a harsh lesson about a different kind of power, the power of accountability in the digital age. Back on the aircraft, as it finally lifted off from LAX, Xavier sat beside his father, the bodybuilders' vacated seats a visual reminder of justice served. The cabin was quieter now. Passengers settled into their own thoughts and activities after the unexpected drama of departure. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked his son quietly. Xavier nodded. "Better now." He paused, then added, "Do you think they understand what they did wrong?" Jackson considered the question. "Some lessons take time to sink in, but I suspect they're beginning to." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. As Xavier had stood alone in the galley area, caught between the first-class cabin where he belonged and the economy section where others thought he should be, a complex storm of emotions had churned within him. The calm exterior he maintained, shoulders back, expression, neutral voice, steady, concealed an inner turbulence that only he could feel. The most immediate emotion had been humiliation, the burning awareness that he had been singled out, questioned, touched against his will, all in front of a plane full of strangers. It wasn't just about being denied his seat. It was about being denied his dignity, his rightful place, his humanity. Beneath that had been anger, not the hot, explosive kind that leads to rash actions, but a cold, clear fury that sharpened his thoughts, even as it twisted in his chest. Anger at Brock and Diego for their prejudice at Melissa, for her cowardice at the other passengers, for their silence, and in some small measure at himself for not finding a way to resolve the situation independently. But what had troubled Xavier most, what had caused his hands to tremble slightly as he texted his father, was the familiar battle between two competing instincts, the desire to stand his ground versus the strategic wisdom of choosing his battles. His father had taught him both, to know his worth unequivocally, but also to recognize when a direct confrontation might not be the wisest course. Sometimes the strongest move isn't charging forward. Jackson had told him once after Xavier had come home frustrated from a basketball game where a referee had made clearly biased calls against his team. Sometimes it's taking a step back, assessing the full situation and choosing the most effective response rather than the most immediate one. That lesson had resonated with Xavier now as he decided to text his father rather than escalate the confrontation with the bodybuilders. It wasn't retreat, it was strategy. It wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Still, the decision had come with its own emotional cost. The fear that he was failing some unspoken test of manhood, of independence, of courage. These thoughts had occupied him as he stood in the galley, as Melissa offered her belated apology, as Nathan suggested he wait in the cockpit. The complexity of navigating these situations, knowing when to speak up, when to step back, when to call for backup, was exhausting in a way that his white peers would likely never understand. Xavier had been 8 years old when his father first sat him down for the talk. Not about the birds and the bees, but about being a young black man in America. Jackson had been gentle but unflinchingly honest. There will be times when people look at you and see only your skin, not your heart or your mind. There will be times when you have to be twice as good to be seen as equal. There will be times when you have to swallow your pride to stay safe. The conversation had continued over years, evolving as Xavier grew, becoming more nuanced, more strategic. Jackson had taught him about maintaining dignity without escalation, about documenting incidents, about knowing his rights, while recognizing the reality that those rights weren't always respected. What Jackson hadn't explicitly said, but what Xavier had gradually understood, was how these calculations had continued even after his father had achieved wealth and fame. Money and status provided some protection but never immunity. The bubble of privilege was real but permeable, as today's incident had proven. Standing in that galley, Xavier had found himself mentally rehearsing how he would describe this incident to his grandmother. Elaine Mitchell had marched with Dr. King in the 1960s, had integrated a white school as a teacher in the 1970s, had raised Jackson as a single mother in a tough neighborhood in the 1980s. Her perspective spanned generations of struggle and progress. Would she be disappointed that he had stepped away rather than insisting on his rights? Or would she appreciate the strategic wisdom in his decision to call for backup? Her voice seemed to echo in his mind. Dignity isn't about never retreating. It's about never surrendering who you are, even when you have to take a step back. These reflections had been interrupted by the increased activity at the front of the plane, the subtle shift in energy that signaled something was happening. And then his father had appeared. Solid, certain a physical manifestation of safety and justice. Now, as the plane climbed into the evening sky over Los Angeles, Xavier found himself processing yet another complex mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly. Vindication, yes. But also an unexpected melancholy. The recognition that even at 15, even as the son of Jackson Mitchell, he still lived in a world where his belonging could be questioned based on the color of his skin. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, noticing his son's distant expression. Xavier considered deflecting the question, but decided on honesty. "I'm thinking about what would have happened if I wasn't your son." Jackson nodded, understanding immediately. "If you were just any young black man on that plane." "Yeah. Would anyone have spoken up for me? Would the airline have cared?" These weren't abstract questions. They were painfully concrete possibilities. Alternate realities that might have played out if Xavier Mitchell had just been Xavier without the protection of his father's name and influence. "Some would have cared," Jackson said carefully. "That woman who recorded everything. She spoke up before she knew who you were." One person, Xavier noted, out of an entire cabin. "Sometimes one person is all it takes to start something," Jackson replied. "But you're right. The response would likely have been different. That's the reality we're still working to change." Xavier appreciated his father's honesty. Jackson had never sugarcoated these truths, had never pretended that wealth or status had erased the fundamental inequities they navigated. "I keep thinking about what you always say, about knowing when to stand your ground and when to be strategic," Xavier admitted. "I wasn't sure if texting you was the right choice. Part of me felt like I should have handled it myself." "You did handle it," Jackson said firmly. "You assessed the situation, recognized the risks, and made a strategic decision to call for backup. That's not weakness, Xavier. That's exactly what I've tried to teach you." The validation eased something in Xavier's chest, the quiet fear that he had somehow failed a test of manhood or independence. Besides, Jackson continued with a small smile, "You gave me the opportunity to see those two backpedal when they realized who you were. That was educational for them." Xavier couldn't help but smile at that. They did look pretty shocked. "People often are when their assumptions get shattered," Jackson observed. "But the real question is whether they learn from it or just regret getting caught." That distinction between genuine learning and mere regret at consequences struck Xavier as profound. He wondered which category Brock and Diego would fall into, whether this incident would prompt real reflection or just resentment. "Do you think they'll learn anything from this?" he asked. Jackson considered the question seriously. "Some lessons take longer than others to sink in. But sometimes a public reckoning is what it takes to begin that process." Xavier nodded, thinking about the videos that were likely already circulating online. In today's world, actions had digital permanence, a fact that Brock and Diego were probably beginning to appreciate. As the flight attendants began their service, Melissa approached their row with visible trepidation. "Can I get you gentlemen anything to drink?" she asked, her voice carefully professional. "Water for me, please," Jackson replied. "Xavier, apple juice," Xavier said. Melissa nodded and moved away quickly, clearly still uncomfortable with her role in what had transpired. "Are you going to say anything to the airline?" Xavier asked once she was out of earshot. "Already have," Jackson replied. "Thomas is handling it. There will be consequences beyond just removing those two from the flight." Xavier nodded, appreciating his father's thoroughness. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability and prevention, ensuring that the next teenager who boarded alone wouldn't face the same treatment. as the cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled in for the long flight to New York. Xavier felt himself relaxing for the first time since he'd boarded. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion, but also clarity. He had faced ugliness today, had been reminded of harsh realities, but had also witnessed justice in action. More importantly, he had been reminded that he wasn't navigating these waters alone. His father's presence beside him was both literal and symbolic, a reminder of support, of solidarity, of shared experience across generations. Xavier leaned back in his seat, allowing his eyes to close. There would be more battles, more moments of decision, more calculations about when to stand firm and when to step back. But for now, in this moment, he could rest secure in the knowledge that he had handled today's challenge with dignity and wisdom beyond his 15 years. Jackson Mitchell's appearance in the doorway of Flight 628 created an immediate shift in the cabin's energy. Even before anyone recognized who he was, his presence commanded attention. The confident posture, the purposeful stride, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from him. He moved with the controlled precision of a lifelong athlete, each step deliberate as his eyes scanned the cabin. Passengers who had been absorbed in books or devices looked up, sensing something significant was happening. The low murmur of conversation dimmed to silence. For those who recognized him, and many did, the reaction was immediate widened eyes, hushed whispers, the subtle shift of posture that occurs when someone famous unexpectedly enters a room. Jackson Mitchell wasn't just wealthy or influential. He was iconic. His face had appeared on magazine covers, billboards, and television screens for over a decade. His 5 championship belts, business empire, and philanthropic work had made him a household name. But it wasn't celebrity that drove him now as he strode toward his son. It was something more primal, more powerful, the instinct to protect his child. When he reached Xavier in the galley, the first words out of his mouth were not about the situation or the men responsible, but a simple question. Are you hurt? It was the question of a father, not a billionaire, or a fighter, or a public figure. In that moment, none of those identities mattered. Only the well-being of his son. Xavier's answer, no, just conveyed everything that couldn't be articulated in words. The humiliation, the anger, the relief at seeing his father. Jackson understood it all without further explanation, his hand on Xavier's shoulder, both assessing and reassuring. As Jackson turned to address the situation, his demeanor shifted subtly. The father remained, but now the strategist emerged, the man who had built an empire by anticipating opponents' moves, by understanding leverage points, by knowing exactly when to apply pressure. I appreciate that he told Nathan when informed they were addressing the situation, but I'll be handling it from here. The statement wasn't arrogant or confrontational. It was simply factual, a clear delineation of what would happen next. Jackson Mitchell didn't raise his voice or make threats. He didn't need to. His quiet certainty was more effective than any display of anger could have been. When Xavier pointed out the men responsible, Jackson absorbed the information with a slight nod, his expression betraying nothing of the cold fury building inside him. Only those who knew him well, like Xavier, might have caught the brief flash in his eyes there and gone in an instant. I understand, Jackson said. Wait here. As he moved toward the first-class cabin, Xavier caught his arm. Dad, don't. The unfinished warning reflected Xavier's concern. Not that his father would cause a scene, but that he might be disappointed by what he found by the ugly reality his son had faced. Jackson looked back, understanding the concern behind the warning. Trust me. With those 2 words, he stepped into the first-class cabin, where Brock and Diego remained oblivious to what was about to unfold. Their reaction upon recognizing Jackson was almost comical in its transition. From annoyance at the interruption to shock, from shock to confusion, from confusion to dawning horror as they connected the dots between this man and the teenager they had harassed. Holy shit, Diego had said. You're Jackson Mitchell. No way Brock had added excitement temporarily overriding his awareness of the situation. "We're huge fans, man. Your fight against Dominguez was legendary. Their attempts at familiarity, at establishing some kind of fan connection, fell flat against Jackson's steady gaze. He didn't acknowledge their admiration or respond to their recognition. Instead, he cut directly to the matter at hand. "I understand you had an issue with a young man trying to sit in seat 2A, he said, his tone deceptively conversational. The phrase "a young man" was deliberate, not immediately identifying Xavier as his son, giving them rope with which to potentially hang themselves. Would they reveal their true attitudes unaware of his connection to the teenager they had humiliated? "Oh, that," Brock said dismissively. "Yeah, some kid tried to sit up here, obviously in the wrong place. We were just helping the flight attendant sort it out." The casual dismissal, the assumption that they had been in the right, told Jackson everything he needed to know about their character, or lack thereof. "I see," Jackson said. "And did sorting it out involve taking his boarding pass and putting your hands on him?" The directness of the question created immediate discomfort. Diego shifted in his seat, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "Look, there was obviously some confusion," Diego tried to explain. "The kid started filming us without permission, and I just—" "That kid," Jackson interrupted, his voice still controlled but with an edge that hadn't been there before, "is my son." The three simple words landed with devastating effect. Brock's face drained of color. Diego froze mid-sentence. Around them, other passengers reacted with murmurs and wide eyes, the drama unfolding before them better than any in-flight entertainment. "Your son," Brock repeated, his voice suddenly much smaller than his frame would suggest. The shift was immediate and telling. The way their demeanor changed once they realized Xavier wasn't just any teenager, but the son of Jackson Mitchell. It revealed the conditional nature of their respect based not on recognizing another human being's dignity, but on calculating the potential consequences of their actions. Jackson didn't miss this revelation, nor did he let it pass unchallenged. Xavier Mitchell, he confirmed, 15 years old, flying to visit his grandmother in New York, sitting in seat 2A, which he paid for, until you decided he didn't belong there. The implication behind his words was clear, laying bare the assumptions that had driven their behavior. Assumptions based on Xavier's race and age. Neither bodybuilder seemed to have an answer for this. Their previous confidence evaporated in the face of accountability. Mr. Mitchell Diego began, his tone shifting to desperate placation. "There was a misunderstanding. We didn't know that he was my son." Jackson finished the sentence. "And if he hadn't been, if he had just been any young black teenager with a valid first-class ticket, would that have made your behavior acceptable?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a mirror forcing them to confront the ugliness of their actions without the comfort of excuses. Brock, desperate to salvage the situation, tried another approach. "We're huge supporters of your career, sir. Have been for years. We didn't mean any disrespect." And yet Jackson replied, "Disrespect is exactly what you showed. Not just to my son, but to yourselves, to this flight crew, and to everyone watching." The coldness in his voice made both men flinch. This wasn't the Jackson Mitchell from interviews and endorsement deals. This was the calculating strategist who had dismantled opponents in the octagon, who had built a business empire from nothing, who protected what was his with absolute resolve. "What happens next," Jackson continued, "is entirely up to you." It was a statement that contained multitudes, a reminder of their agency in this moment, but also a clear indication that consequences would follow one way or another. The choice wasn't whether there would be repercussions, but rather what form they would take. Brock swallowed hard. We didn't mean any harm, sir." "Intent and impact are different things," Jackson replied. "Your actions harmed my son regardless of what you meant." Diego leaned forward, desperation evident. "Look, we made a mistake. Okay? We'll apologize to the kid to your son. An apology is a starting point," Jackson acknowledged. "But it doesn't erase consequences." His gaze swept around the cabin, noting the attentive audience their confrontation had gathered. Every passenger was watching intently, some even recording discreetly on their phones. This had become more than a private dispute. It was now a public reckoning. Jackson lowered his voice, making both men lean in to hear him. "Here's what's going to happen. You will apologize to my son, sincerely and publicly. You will acknowledge exactly what you did wrong. Then you will leave this aircraft and take a different flight." Leave Brock protested. "But we have a competition tomorrow. We can't miss this flight." "You should have considered that before putting your hands on a minor." Jackson replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "This is bullshit," Diego muttered, then immediately regretted it when Jackson's gaze locked onto him. "Would you care to repeat that?" Jackson asked quietly. Diego shrank back. "No, sir. I thought not." Jackson straightened. "Nathan," he called to the lead flight attendant who was hovering nearby. "I'd like to speak with the captain, please." From there, events moved with inexorable momentum. The captain approved the removal of Brock and Diego. They were instructed to gather their belongings. They delivered their awkward, strained apologies to Xavier, who received them with dignity beyond his years. Then they were escorted from the aircraft, their expressions a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and dawning realization that this incident would follow them long after they'd left the plane. As they disappeared down the jet bridge, Jackson took the seat beside his son, not in the row where Brock and Diego had been sitting, but in 2B next to Xavier's rightful seat in 2A. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. The teenager who had been told he didn't belong was now exactly where he was supposed to be, his father beside him, the men who had questioned his place, nowhere to be seen. "I'm proud of you," Jackson told Xavier quietly as the plane finally began to push back from the gate. "You handled this with more maturity than most adults would have." Xavier looked at his father. "I wanted to stand up for myself, but I didn't want to make a scene." "You did stand up for yourself," Jackson corrected him. "Asking for help when you need it isn't weakness, it's wisdom." As the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the evening sky, father and son sat side by side, their conversation turning to other topics. Xavier's grandmother waiting in New York, the upcoming spring break, a new book they'd both been reading. To anyone observing, they might have seemed like any other family traveling together. But the ripples from what had transpired were already spreading outward far beyond the confines of Flight 628. Sofia Rodriguez's video was being shared across social media platforms. Passengers were texting friends and family about witnessing Jackson Mitchell defend his son against these huge bodybuilder guys, and in a different terminal waiting for their rebooked flight. Brock Lawson and Diego Hernandez were beginning to understand that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with a hasty apology or a charming smile. Some mistakes changed everything. As Flight 628 approached its final 2 hours, the consequences of the confrontation were already unfolding across multiple fronts. In Terminal B, Brock and Diego had retreated to a quiet corner of an airport restaurant, attempting to formulate a response to the crisis engulfing them. "We need to make a video," Brock insisted, his eyes bloodshot from stress. "Explain our side, apologize properly." Diego nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "Worth a try, but I don't know if it'll make a difference at this point." They positioned themselves against a neutral wall, adjusted the lighting as best they could, and began recording on Brock's phone. "Hey everyone," Brock began, his usual boisterous confidence notably absent. "We wanted to address what happened earlier today on our flight to New York." Diego leaned in. "We made a mistake. We judged someone based on appearances, and that was wrong. We're not racist," Brock added hastily. "We have black friends train with black athletes. This was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." The apology continued in that vein. acknowledging wrongdoing but with qualifications, expressing regret, but primarily for the consequences they were facing, invoking their black friends as evidence of their character. Within minutes of posting, the comments section exploded. The "I have black friends" defense. Really notice how they're sorry they got caught, not sorry for what they did. This is damage control, not a genuine apology. Their manager called again, his voice tight with frustration. "Take that video down immediately. You're making it worse." "We're trying to apologize," Brock protested. "No, you're trying to save your careers," Jordan corrected harshly. "And you're failing. Take it down, stay quiet, and wait until I can get a proper PR team to help you craft a statement." By the time they deleted the video, it had already been downloaded and reshared thousands of times. Another misstep in a day filled with them another piece of evidence in the public's ongoing assessment of their character. Meanwhile, in the corporate offices of United Airlines, an emergency meeting was underway. The viral video had caught the attention of senior management who recognized the potential for significant reputational damage. Xavier Mitchell isn't just any passenger, the chief communications officer was explaining. He has enormous influence, especially in the black community. How we handle this will be scrutinized. The CEO nodded grimly. "I've tried calling him directly. His assistant says he'll respond tomorrow." "Tomorrow might be too late," the CCO warned. "The narrative is already forming without us." After discussion, they approved an immediate statement. United Airlines is aware of the incident that occurred during boarding of Flight 628. The behavior described does not reflect our values or expectations for passenger experience. We are investigating this matter thoroughly and will take appropriate action. We have reached out to the Mitchell family directly and reiterate that all passengers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The carefully worded statement was designed to acknowledge the issue without admitting liability, to express concern without making specific commitments. It was corporate damage control 101, and social media users recognized it immediately for what it was. Generic corporate non-apology. How about firing the flight attendant who enabled the harassment? What appropriate action exactly? Be specific. The demand for transparency, for concrete action rather than vague assurances, reflected a shift in public expectations around corporate responsibility. People weren't satisfied with carefully crafted statements. They wanted tangible evidence of change. On Flight 628, Xavier and Jackson remained largely unaware of these developments, though occasional updates came through when one of them checked their phones during periods of satellite connectivity. Another sponsor dropped them, Xavier noted, scrolling through his feed. "And there's a petition for the airline to change its training procedures." Jackson wasn't surprised. The internet can be a powerful force for accountability when directed productively. "Is it always productive, though?" Xavier asked thoughtfully. "Sometimes it feels like people just pile on without understanding the full context." It was a mature question, one that recognized the complexity of digital accountability, the thin line between justice and mob mentality. "It's a double-edged sword," Jackson acknowledged. "At its best, it gives voice to those who might otherwise be ignored, creates pressure for genuine change. At its worst, it can become disproportionate, lacking nuance or mercy." "Which is this?" Xavier pressed. Jackson considered the question carefully. "In this case, I think it's largely justified. Their behavior was clearly inappropriate, captured on video without manipulation or distortion. The consequences, losing sponsorships, facing public criticism, seem proportional to publicly humiliating a teenager and putting hands on him without consent." Xavier nodded, accepting his father's assessment. "I don't want them to lose everything, though. Just to understand why what they did was wrong." "That's compassionate of you," Jackson said, genuinely impressed by his son's capacity for empathy, even toward those who had wronged him. "And it speaks to the difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. Accountability wants them to learn and change." As they continued their conversation, Nathan approached their row again. "Mr. Mitchell, the captain, is available now if you'd like to speak with him." Jackson glanced at Xavier, who nodded. "We'll both come," Jackson decided. In the cockpit, Captain Foster greeted them with evident concern. "Mr. Mitchell, Xavier, thank you for taking the time. I wanted to personally express how deeply sorry I am for what happened during boarding." "I appreciate that," Jackson replied, "though the responsibility lies primarily with the passengers who behaved inappropriately, not with you." Perhaps Captain Foster acknowledged. "But as captain, everything that happens on my aircraft ultimately falls under my responsibility, including the actions of my crew." This willingness to accept accountability rather than deflect it impressed both Mitchells. "What concerns me most," the captain continued, "is that our procedures failed your son. A passenger's boarding pass was taken from him, he was physically accosted, and initially our crew didn't intervene effectively. That represents a systemic failure, not just an individual one. The acknowledgement of broader issues, rather than isolating the incident as a one-time anomaly, was significant. It suggested an understanding that what Xavier had experienced wasn't just about two problematic passengers, but about broader patterns that needed addressing. "What changes do you envision?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious about the captain's perspective. "I've already drafted recommendations for revised training protocols," Captain Foster explained, specifically addressing how to handle situations where passengers question another passenger's right to be in certain cabins, with clear guidelines about validating boarding passes directly rather than taking one passenger's word over another's. The conversation continued for several minutes, touching on specific procedural changes, training improvements, and accountability mechanisms. Throughout, Xavier listened attentively occasionally, offering his own perspective when asked. As they prepared to return to their seats, Captain Foster addressed Xavier directly. "Young man, I want you to know that you handled yourself with remarkable composure today. Many adults wouldn't have shown the same dignity under similar circumstances." "Thank you," Sir Xavier replied, the praise clearly meaningful coming from a figure of authority who had no reason to offer it except genuine respect. Back in their seats, Xavier turned to his father. He seemed genuinely concerned, not just worried about lawsuits. "I think he was." Jackson agreed. "There are still good people trying to do the right thing even within imperfect systems. That distinction between individuals and systems, between personal responsibility and institutional change, was at the heart of many of their conversations about justice." Jackson had always tried to teach Xavier to recognize both, to hold individuals accountable for their choices, while also acknowledging the larger structures that shaped those choices. As the plane began its initial descent toward New York, passenger phones buzzed with the news that had been accumulating during their time in the air. The video had now been viewed over 5 million times across platforms. The airline's statement had been issued and widely criticized as inadequate. Multiple sponsors had suspended or terminated their relationships with Brock and Diego. The bodybuilding competition had issued a statement banning both men from the weekend's events. The swift and public nature of these consequences reflected a cultural shift, one in which documentation through smartphones and amplification through social media had created new mechanisms of accountability, new ways for previously invisible injustices to be seen and addressed. Whether this digital accountability would translate into lasting change remained to be seen. But for Xavier Mitchell, watching the skyline of New York appear through his window, the events of today had provided a powerful lesson that standing up for your dignity might not always be easy, but it was always necessary. And sometimes when you stood up for yourself, others would stand with you. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into JFK International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The familiar announcement triggered the usual flurry of activity. tray tables being raised, seats adjusted to their upright positions, bags stowed securely. Yet there was something different about the atmosphere in the first-class cabin of Flight 628, a current of awareness that had been absent at the beginning of the journey. Passengers who had witnessed what happened during boarding now exchanged glances with new understanding. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with heightened attentiveness, particularly toward Xavier. The shared experience had created an unspoken connection, a collective acknowledgement that something significant had transpired. Melissa approached Xavier in Jackson's row, her manner different from earlier, not just professionally courteous but genuinely remorseful. She had been avoiding direct interaction since the confrontation, clearly uncomfortable with her role in what had happened. "Xavier," she said, his name tentative on her lips. "I wanted to speak with you before we land." Xavier looked up, his expression neutral but not hostile. "I failed you today." Melissa continued, her voice steady despite the evident emotion behind it. "I had a choice when those men questioned your right to be in first class. I could have checked your boarding pass myself, confirmed your seat assignment directly. Instead, I took the path of least resistance." The admission was striking in its directness. No qualifications, no excuses, just a clear acknowledgement of responsibility. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have made," she went on. "I prioritized avoiding conflict with loud passengers over ensuring justice for a quieter one. That was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Xavier studied her for a moment, weighing her words against her actions earlier. "Thank you for saying that," he finally responded. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake. Not as much courage as it took for you to maintain your dignity throughout that situation," Melissa replied. "I've learned something important today, that sometimes doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the easy thing, and that protecting those who need protection is part of my job, not just serving drinks and ensuring comfort." Jackson, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "That's an important lesson. What will you do differently next time?" The question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely interested in her growth and how this incident might shape her future actions. "I'll remember that my primary responsibility is to ensure all passengers are treated with dignity," Melissa answered thoughtfully. "I'll verify facts directly rather than accepting one person's word over another's. And I'll recognize that sometimes the person making the most noise isn't the one who's right." These weren't just platitudes. They were specific commitments, evidence of genuine reflection, rather than merely trying to avoid consequences. "I'm also going to report this incident myself," she added through official channels, with a complete description of how I failed in my duty. "I want this to be a learning opportunity, not just for me, but for our training programs." Jackson nodded approvingly. "Then you've already taken the first step toward being better tomorrow than you were today. That's all any of us can do." As Melissa moved away to continue her preparations for landing, Xavier turned to his father. "Do you think she means it, or is she just worried about her job?" "I think she means it," Jackson replied after consideration. "Real regret has a particular quality to it, a willingness to name exactly what you did wrong without defensiveness." "She did that," Xavier nodded, processing this perspective. "I'm glad. I didn't want her to lose her job over this." "That compassion speaks well of you," Jackson observed. "Many people in your position would want maximum punishment for everyone involved." "Punishment doesn't always create change," though, Xavier noted, echoing lessons his father had taught him over years of conversations about justice and accountability. "Sometimes it just creates resentment." As the plane continued its descent, other passengers began to approach their row, not intrusively, but with evident purpose. The first was Alan Winters, the retired professor who had witnessed the entire confrontation from seat 3C. "Young man," he addressed Xavier, "I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner when those men were harassing you. I saw what was happening, but I hesitated, told myself it wasn't my place to intervene." The admission was clearly difficult for him. Acknowledgement of a moral failure from a man whose academic career had likely been built on ethical principles. By the time I decided to say something, your father had arrived, Alan continued. But that's no excuse. Injustice requires witnesses to become participants, not just observers. I failed that test today, and I'm sorry. Xavier, somewhat overwhelmed by this unexpected apology, responded with grace beyond his years. Thank you for saying that, sir. Maybe next time will be different. It already is different, Alan replied firmly. What I witnessed today has changed something fundamental in how I understand my responsibility as a bystander. I won't make the same mistake again. Similar interactions followed. The anniversary couple expressing their regret for remaining silent, a businessman acknowledging his discomfort, but in action. Each conversation represented a small ripple effect from the central confrontation evidence that what had transpired had affected not just those directly involved, but the wider community of witnesses. Not everyone approached, of course. Some passengers remained absorbed in their own concerns, untouched or uninterested in the moral dimensions of what they had observed. But enough did to suggest that the incident had catalyzed genuine reflection among many present. As the aircraft made its final approach to JFK, the Manhattan skyline visible through the windows on the left side of the plane, Xavier found himself in a surprisingly peaceful state of mind. The humiliation and anger of earlier had not disappeared entirely, but they had been transformed by the resolution that followed, by his father's intervention, by the consequences delivered by the apologies offered, and by the evidence that his experience had created ripples of awareness and commitment to change. "We're almost there," Jackson observed, noticing Xavier's contemplative expression as they descended through clouds toward the sprawling airport below. "Your grandmother will be waiting. She's going to have opinions about all this," Xavier said with a small smile. Undoubtedly, Jackson agreed, returning the smile. "Probably a lecture for both of us. Me for not teaching you more assertiveness, you for not channeling the Mitchell family backbone." They both chuckled at the accurate characterization of Elaine Mitchell's likely response. The woman who had raised Jackson as a single mother in Harlem, who had fought her own battles against discrimination throughout her career as an educator, who had instilled in her son and grandson both fierce pride and strategic wisdom, would indeed have much to say about today's events. The plane touched down with a gentle bump rolling along the runway as passengers instinctively reached for phones, preparing to reconnect with the world after hours of limited connectivity. The captain's voice came over the intercom, thanking them for flying United and announcing the local time and temperature. As they taxied toward the gate, Sofia Rodriguez leaned forward from her seat. "I've shared the video with both of you via email," she said quietly, "in case you need it for any reason, and I'd be happy to provide a formal statement about what I witnessed." "Thank you," Jackson replied with genuine appreciation. "For the video, but more importantly for speaking up when it mattered. I've been on the other side of that situation too many times," Sophia explained. "Watched people make assumptions about whether I belonged in certain spaces based on how I looked. I couldn't stay silent when I saw it happening to someone else. That solidarity, the recognition of shared experiences across different backgrounds, was perhaps the most powerful form of allyship built not just on abstract principles, but on lived understanding of the harm caused by exclusion and prejudice." As the seatbelt sign was turned off and passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and forming the impatient queue in the aisle, Xavier and Jackson remained seated, allowing others to deplane first. It was partly consideration, giving those with tight connections priority, and partly strategic, avoiding the awkwardness of being the center of attention in the narrow confines of the aisle. "Ready?" Jackson asked as the cabin cleared. Xavier nodded, standing and retrieving his backpack from the overhead bin. Together they moved toward the exit, thanking the flight crew as they passed. At the aircraft door, Nathan offered a final acknowledgement. "Mr. Mitchell Xavier, Thank you for your grace throughout this situation. It's been a learning experience for all of us. Outside in the jet bridge connecting the aircraft to the terminal, Xavier paused for a moment. Dad. Yes. Thank you for coming. For handling it the way you did. Jackson placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of both affection and solidarity. Always Xavier. No matter what, no matter when. I will always be there when you need me. With that simple but profound reassurance, they continued into the terminal, leaving behind the aircraft that had been the setting for both injustice and resolution, both humiliation and vindication. The incident itself was over, but its effects would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. 3 days after the incident on Flight 628, Xavier and Jackson sat in Elaine Mitchell's Harlem apartment watching CNN's coverage of what had now become a national conversation. The network was showing clips from Sophia's video interspersed with commentary from various analysts discussing the broader implications. This incident has sparked renewed discussions about racial profiling in customer service settings, the anchor was saying. The video, which has now been viewed over 20 million times across platforms, shows bodybuilders Brock Lawson and Diego Hernandez questioning a black teenager's right to sit in first class, ultimately leading to physical contact when the teen began recording their behavior. The screen changed to show side-by-side images Brock and Diego's social media profiles from before the incident, showcasing their muscular physiques and sponsorship deals, contrasted with current statements from companies severing ties with them. The professional fallout has been swift and significant. The anchor continued. Major supplement companies, Max Pump and Vitaforce, have terminated their contracts with both men citing violations of morality clauses. Gymwear Athletic has removed their content from its advertising campaigns. And the Eastern Seaboard Championship, where they were scheduled to compete last weekend, banned them from participation. Elaine Mitchell, 68 years old with silver hair worn in elegant twists, and the same penetrating gaze as her son, snorted dismissively. Consequences. It's about time. The internet moves fast, Grandma Xavier observed. Too long, Elaine replied firmly. In my day, there were no videos, no social media, just your word against theirs, and guess whose word carried more weight? The rhetorical question carried the weight of decades of similar experiences of injustices witnessed and endured. Jackson, who had been relatively quiet during the coverage, spoke up. The airline called again this morning. They're implementing new training protocols specifically addressing how staff should handle situations where passengers question another passenger's right to be in certain cabins. Will it make a difference? Elaine asked skeptically. Some Jackson acknowledged. It's a start, at least. Better than the usual corporate response of treating it as an isolated incident rather than a pattern. The news had moved on to showing Brock and Diego's attempted apology video, the awkward delivery and questionable phrasing that had only intensified the backlash against them. Look at them, Elaine said, shaking her head. Still don't understand what they did wrong. We have black friends. Like that's some kind of shield against accountability. Xavier, who had been quietly contemplative throughout the coverage, finally spoke. I almost feel sorry for them. Both his father and grandmother looked at him with surprise. Not because they don't deserve consequences, Xavier clarified quickly. They do. But because they probably genuinely don't understand why what they did was so wrong. They've probably been treating people that way for years just without cameras recording it. There was wisdom in this observation. The recognition that the bodybuilder's behavior likely reflected deeply ingrained patterns, rather than a single bad decision that they were products of a culture that had normalized certain forms of exclusion and entitlement. That's insightful, Xavier Jackson said. Empathy doesn't mean excusing behavior. It means understanding its context. Elaine studied her grandson with evident pride. You've raised him well, Jackson. He sees beyond the surface. The news segment concluded with an update on Brock and Diego's professional situation. Sources close to the bodybuilders report that they are working with a crisis management team and diversity consultants to understand the impact of their actions and determine appropriate next steps. Whether this will be sufficient to salvage their careers remains to be seen. Jackson turned off the television, the silence that followed allowing for reflection. The 3 generations of Mitchells sat together in Elaine's comfortable living room, surrounded by family photos chronicling their journey. Elaine as a young teacher fighting for educational equality, Jackson's rise from determined young fighter to businessman and philanthropist, Xavier's growth from toddler to thoughtful young man. "You know," Elaine said after a moment, "what strikes me most about this whole situation is how little has changed and how much has changed simultaneously." "What do you mean?" Grandma Xavier asked. "The assumptions, the profiling, the questioning of whether black people belong in certain spaces. That hasn't changed much from my day," Elaine explained. "But the response to it, the accountability, the public reckoning, that's new. When I was your age, there would have been no video, no viral spread, no sponsors pulling contracts, no corporate apologies." Jackson nodded in agreement. "The mechanisms of accountability have evolved even if the underlying issues persist. And that's progress," Elaine declared firmly. "Not enough, not nearly enough, but progress nonetheless." Xavier considered this perspective, appreciating its nuance. Neither overly optimistic about how much had changed, nor entirely pessimistic about the possibility of further change. It was a balanced view that acknowledged both the persistent reality of racism and the genuine advancements in addressing it. "I've been invited to speak at a conference next month," Jackson mentioned, "about using influence and platform to address social issues. I'm thinking of discussing this incident with your permission, Xavier." Xavier thought about it carefully. The idea of having their personal experience become part of a public conversation was complex, potentially valuable for the awareness it might raise, but also potentially reducing a deeply personal moment to a case study. "I think that would be okay," he decided finally. "If it helps others understand, if it creates some kind of change." "That's the Mitchell family purpose," Elaine stated with conviction. "Using our experiences, whatever platform we have, to create pathways for those who come after us. My generation did it through marches and integration. Your father does it through philanthropy and influence. You'll find your own way, Xavier." The weight of this legacy, not a burden but a calling, settled over Xavier with new clarity. What had happened on that plane wasn't just about him, wasn't just about 2 bodybuilders who had made poor choices. It was part of a much larger, longer story of resistance and progress, of holding ground and creating change. As the afternoon sun streamed through Elaine's windows, illuminating 3 generations of a family that had consistently refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose, Xavier felt a profound sense of connection to his father and grandmother. Yes, but also to the larger community of those who had faced similar moments and made similar choices, to stand firm in their dignity, to insist on their right to occupy space, to transform individual incidents into catalysts for collective change. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The spring evening had settled over New York, the city lights beginning to twinkle against the deepening blue sky. In Elaine Mitchell's Harlem apartment, 3 generations sat on the balcony, watching the neighborhood below come alive with its familiar rhythm of voices, music, and movement. Xavier had spent a week with his grandmother, a week filled with stories of her civil rights activism, chess matches that sharpened his strategic thinking, and conversations that deepened his understanding of both history and current events. Tomorrow, Jackson would return from his business meetings, and they would fly back to Los Angeles together. "You know," Elaine said, breaking a comfortable silence, "what happened on that plane isn't just your story. It's part of something larger." Xavier nodded. "I've been thinking about that a lot, about how what I experienced is something so many people go through without having the resources or platform to address it. Exactly, Elaine agreed. And that's why what you do with this experience matters. Not just how you process it personally, but how you let it inform your choices moving forward. In the weeks since the incident, the public conversation had evolved. United Airlines had announced comprehensive changes to their training protocols, specifically addressing how staff should handle situations where passengers question another passenger's right to be in certain spaces. Brock and Diego had issued a more thoughtful apology acknowledging the racial dimensions of their behavior and committing to education and growth rather than just damage control. Most significantly, Jackson had established the Dignity Initiative, a foundation focused on documenting and addressing patterns of exclusion in public spaces with particular attention to transportation and hospitality settings. The foundation would provide resources for individuals facing discrimination work with companies to improve policies and training and fund research on effective interventions. Dad says you should join the youth advisory board for the foundation, Xavier told his grandmother. Says they need your perspective. Elaine laughed. Your father knows exactly how to keep me busy in my so-called retirement. But he's right. Those young people will need guidance from someone who's seen how these battles have evolved over decades. As the evening deepened around them, Xavier reflected on the journey from that moment in the airplane galley, standing alone, humiliated but resolute, to this point of purposeful response. The incident itself had been painful, but its aftermath had created opportunities for meaningful change, both personal and structural. Real strength, Elaine said, as if reading his thoughts isn't about muscle or money or even fame. It's about character, about how you respond when tested, about using whatever resources you have to stand for something larger than yourself. Xavier nodded, understanding the truth in his grandmother's words. What had happened on that flight wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one, a story about dignity maintained in the face of disrespect, about accountability, delivered with purpose rather than vengeance, about transforming individual incidents into catalysts for collective progress. As the stars emerged above the Harlem skyline, Xavier Mitchell sat between his past and his future, grateful for the legacy that had prepared him for that moment on the plane, and committed to honoring that legacy in all the moments yet to come. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of strength, dignity, and justice that need to be heard. Share this video with someone who might need this message today. Sometimes seeing others stand up with grace can give us the courage to do the same. What does strength mean to you? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, true power isn't about muscle or money. It's about character and how we choose to respond when tested.